My father called me on a Sunday morning the way he always called, warm, easy. The particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life picked up a phone expecting bad news. And he asked me if I had any idea who owned the little yellow house on Sycamore Lane, because he had been trying to buy it for 6 months, and the owner kept declining his offers without explanation, and it was starting to genuinely puzzle him. I was sitting at my kitchen table when he called, drinking coffee that had gone slightly cold, looking at a document I had printed the night before, and placed in a cream-colored envelope with my mother's name written on the front in my best handwriting. The document was a recorded property deed. The property was a house on Sycamore Lane. The owner of record as of 11 days earlier was my mother. "I don't know, Dad," I said. "That's a strange one. My name is Nora Calloway. I was 26 years old, 3 days from my mother's 48th birthday, and my father had spent 6 months trying to buy a house that I had already purchased and placed in my mother's name. In the same week, he called me asking if I knew who the mysterious owner was. I did not tell him. I said I hoped he figured it out and asked how the new baby was sleeping. Because my father had a new baby with his third wife, new babies were a reliable subject change in my family, and I stayed on the phone for exactly 11 more minutes before telling him I had to get ready for church, which was not true, and hanging up and sitting very still at my kitchen table for a long moment with my hand on the envelope and the deed inside it, and my mother's name in my handwriting on the front. 3 days, I thought. Just 3 more days. Welcome to Family Revenge Co., where the quiet ones are never as powerless as their families believe. If you love stories about dignity, long patience, and the truth arriving at exactly the right table, at exactly the right moment, stay right here with me. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the moment everything finally turns. To understand why I was sitting at a kitchen table with a property deed in an envelope addressed to my mother while my father called asking me about the same property, you have to go back 14 years to the specific Sunday afternoon when I was 12 years old and my parents sat me down in the living room of the house on Sycamore Lane and told me, in the careful measured language of 2 people who had rehearsed this conversation several times and still hadn't found a version that felt clean, that they were getting a divorce. I grew up in a family that looked, from the outside, like the kind of family that doesn't fall apart. My father, Dennis Calloway, was a sales manager for a regional manufacturing company, the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and birthday and favorite sports team, and who could walk into a room of strangers and leave it 40 minutes later with 3 new friends and a standing dinner invitation. My mother, Patricia, worked as a dental hygienist and ran the household with the quiet, methodical competence of someone who had decided early that the best way to manage a life was to stay slightly ahead of it at all times, which she did every day, with a consistency that I understood only much later had been costing her more than it should have. They had been, I think, genuinely happy for the early years. There are photographs on my mother's dresser from when I was small, the 3 of us at a lake at Christmas, in the backyard of the Sycamore Lane house, the summer my father built the porch that still stands. And in those photographs, everyone is looking at each other, the way people look at each other when the looking is still easy and unguarded. I study those photographs sometimes, not with sadness exactly, but with the particular attention of someone trying to identify the exact moment the weather changed, and I have never been able to find it. It changed gradually, the way weather always changes when you are standing in it. Imperceptibly at first, then all at once. By the time I was 10, I understood that my parents' marriage had a temperature problem, not cold, not hot, but the specific lukewarm of 2 people who had stopped being unkind to each other and started being, instead, carefully polite, which is sometimes worse. By the time I was 11, I had learned to read the quality of the silence at the table, the way some children learn to read the weather. There was the silence that meant everything was fine, and the silence that meant something was being held just below the surface. And by 11, I could tell the difference without looking up from my plate. The Sunday afternoon they sat me down, I was 12 years and 4 months old, and I already knew what was coming before my father said the first word. The way you know a storm is arriving before the sky actually breaks, the particular pressure change in the air of a household where something large and irreversible has finally been decided. My father did most of the talking. He was better at it, always had been. The words came to him more easily and arranged themselves more naturally and landed more gently than my mother's words did, which tended to be fewer and more precise and sometimes sharper than she intended them to be. He said they loved each other but had grown in different directions. He said this was not anyone's fault. He said that I would always be their daughter, and that nothing about that would change, and that he was going to be present in my life in every way that mattered, and that he wanted me to know, specifically and clearly, that he was already thinking about my future, about college, about making sure I had what I needed, and that I should not spend one moment worrying about any of that, because he was going to take care of it. I am going to take care of it, he said. And he said it with the particular warm certainty of a man who believed the thing he was saying in the specific moment he was saying it, which I have come to understand is not the same thing as a man who will still believe it in a year or 2 or 5 or 14. I nodded. I said, "Okay, Dad." I went to my room and sat on the floor with my back against the bed. And I thought about what it meant that the house on Sycamore Lane, the house with the porch my father had built, was going to become the house where only my mother and I lived, and whether that was something I was going to be able to carry. And I decided, at 12 years and 4 months old, with the particular quiet resolution of a child who has been watching the adults around her carefully for long enough to understand that resolution is sometimes the only available option, that it was. My father moved out 6 weeks later. He rented an apartment on the other side of Cloverfield, 12 minutes from Sycamore Lane, close enough to pick me up on his scheduled weekends, and far enough that the distance felt like a statement about something neither of them was saying out loud. He took the furniture he'd bought and left the furniture my mother had bought, and took the car that was in his name and left the one that was in hers, and the whole process of dividing a shared life into 2 separate ones was accomplished with a thoroughness and an efficiency that I think surprised both of them, as though the marriage had been more separable than either of them had realized while they were inside it. The custody arrangement was alternating weekends and 1 dinner per week, which, on paper, sounds like a reasonable distribution of a father across a child's life, and in practice, as most children of divorce will tell you, feels like considerably less than it sounds. I saw my father every other weekend for the first year, and then every other weekend became sometimes every other weekend, and sometimes every third, and the dinner on Wednesdays became dinner on whichever Wednesday worked with his schedule, which was increasingly not every Wednesday. And by the time I was 14, I had understood, in the way that children understand things they don't have language for yet, that my father's presence in my life had become a thing that required more effort from me than from him, and that the effort was entirely mine to make or not make. I made it, because he was my father and I loved him, which is the thing about loving people who disappoint you consistently. The love does not conveniently adjust itself to match the behavior. You go on loving them while also, slowly and painfully, learning to stop depending on them, and the combination of those 2 things is one of the lonelier experiences available to a human being. My mother did not complain about my father in front of me. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to assume that a woman in her position, single parent, dental hygienist salary, renting the house she had lived in through her marriage because my father had quietly ensured during the divorce proceedings that the house remained a rental rather than an asset she could claim, might have had things to say about her ex-husband that she let slip in front of her daughter. She did not. Patricia Calloway was many things, but she was not the kind of woman who used her child as an audience for grievances, and I respected her for it then, and I respect her for it more now, knowing what I know about what those 14 years actually cost her. What she did instead was work. 2 jobs for the first 3 years after the divorce, the dental hygienist position during the week, and a Saturday shift at a florist shop that she came home from smelling like greenery and cold, water with her hands slightly stained from the stems. She worked with the particular steady, unspectacular consistency of a woman who has decided that the only way through a thing is straight through it, and she kept the Sycamore Lane house warm, and the refrigerator stocked, and my school clothes appropriate, and my homework supervised. And she did all of it without once suggesting to me that any of it was hard, which I knew even at 12 was not the same as it not being hard. The house on Sycamore Lane was not ours. That was the detail my father had managed in the divorce, the specific financial maneuver that I did not fully understand at 12 and understood completely by 22, when I had enough knowledge of how money and property worked to look back at the settlement and see it clearly for what it was. The house was owned by a landlord named Gerald Fitch, who had owned it since the 1980s, and who charged a rent that had been reasonable in the year my parents moved in and had increased, over the 2 decades since, to a figure that was still below market but was, on a single dental hygienist's income, a meaningful portion of every paycheck. My mother paid it every month, on the first, without exception, because Patricia Calloway did not miss payments, not ever, not on the hardest months, not on the months when the car needed something, or the furnace made a sound that required a professional to come look at it. She paid rent on the house where she had raised her daughter and built her life for 14 years after the divorce, and my father told anyone who asked, and some people who didn't, that he was supporting us, that he was putting money aside for Nora's future, that he was taking care of things the way he had promised he would in the living room on the Sunday afternoon when I was 12 years and 4 months old. He was not. I want to tell you that plainly before I tell you how I found out, because the finding out is its own story and it deserves to be told in order. But the fact itself should be stated clearly first, without the cushioning of dramatic buildup. My father was not putting money aside for my future. He was not supporting us in any meaningful financial sense, beyond the court-ordered child support that arrived monthly, and that my mother deposited without comment. He was telling a story about himself that he had told for so long and to so many people that I think he had, at some point along the way, stopped being entirely clear on the difference between the story and the truth. He told it to his colleagues, who sometimes mentioned to me, on the occasions I visited my father's workplace, that Dennis always talked about his daughter and how he was making sure she had everything she needed for college. He told it to his family, my aunts and uncles on his side, who asked me at Christmas gatherings how the college fund was coming along with the comfortable assumption of people who had been told a reassuring thing and saw no reason to question it. He told it, I would discover much later, to the woman who became his second wife and then to the woman who became his third, each of whom had understood from my father's own telling that he was a man who took care of his children, who had never walked away from his responsibilities, who was building something for his daughter's future even now, even still, even while he was building a new life with someone new. He was building no such thing. But I did not know that yet at 12, or at 15, or at 18 when I graduated high school, and my father took me to dinner at a steakhouse and told me, with the warm certainty I had been hearing from him my whole life, that he was proud of me, and that I should not worry about college, because he had been setting things aside, and when the time came, I would have what I needed. I hugged him in the parking lot of the steakhouse. I drove home. I told my mother what he had said. She nodded and said that was good and changed the subject, which was the first time I registered, without fully registering it, that her response to news about my father's college fund had a quality to it that was slightly different from the response of someone who fully believed in the thing being described. I filed that away. I did not examine it yet. I was 18 and it was summer and the fall was coming, and I had been accepted to the state university on a partial merit scholarship, and the rest of it, I told myself, would work itself out, the way my father had been telling me for 6 years it would work itself out. I want to tell you about the fall of my freshman year, because it is the place where this crack appeared in the story my father had been telling, and where I began, for the first time, to suspect that the floor I thought I was standing on was made of something less reliable than I had believed. The financial aid package for my first year had a gap in it. The scholarship covered a portion, the federal loans covered another portion, and there remained an amount that the university's financial aid office, in the particular bureaucratic language of institutions that handled difficult news daily, described as the expected family contribution. I called my father in September of my freshman year and told him about the gap and asked when he was thinking about the money he had been setting aside, because the university needed a payment plan established before the end of the month. My father was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said that he was working through some things financially right now, that the timing was not ideal, that he had some cash flow challenges he was navigating, and that I should go ahead and take out an additional loan for this semester, and he would get things sorted, and by spring the situation would be clearer. I took out the additional loan. I told myself the situation would be clearer by spring. By spring, the situation was not clearer. My father had a new girlfriend, whom I would meet at Easter, and who would become his second wife by the following December, and the cash flow challenges he had been navigating in the fall had apparently resolved themselves sufficiently to fund an engagement ring and a destination wedding in Cancun, though not, it turned out, sufficiently to address the expected family contribution that the university was still waiting for. I took out another loan, and another after that, because that is what you do when the floor turns out to be made of promises rather than substance. You find another way to stand, one semester at a time, and you keep moving, because the alternative is to stop moving, and stopping was never something Patricia Calloway's daughter had been raised to consider an option. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in finance, which I had chosen partly because I was good at it, and partly because I had understood, somewhere in the middle of my freshman year, that the most important thing I could do with my education was learn, as precisely and completely as possible, exactly how money worked, and exactly how people used it, and exactly how the gap between what someone told you they were doing with money and what they were actually doing could be measured, documented, and ultimately revealed. I graduated with $41,000 in student loans, every dollar of which represented a promise my father had made and not kept, and I walked across the stage and shook the dean's hand and looked out at the audience where my mother was sitting in the third row in a blue dress she had bought at a consignment shop and altered, herself, crying the real kind of tears, the kind that come from somewhere deep and long and genuine, and my father was sitting beside her because I had asked them both to come, and they had managed to occupy the same row with the careful, slightly formal politeness of two people who had been practicing at it for a decade. After the ceremony, my father hugged me and said he was proud of me, and that he was sorry things had been tighter than he'd planned, and that he was going to make it right. He was going to find a way to help with the loans. And I hugged him back and said thank you, and did not say the thing I was thinking, which was that I had heard this specific promise in several different forms over the preceding 8 years, and that I had, somewhere in the middle of my junior year, quietly and without drama, stopped believing it. What I had started doing instead, in the middle of my junior year, was paying attention to Sycamore Lane. Paying attention to Sycamore Lane had begun, if I am honest about when exactly it started, not in my junior year of university but much earlier, on a Tuesday evening in October when I was 15 years old, and the furnace in the Sycamore Lane house made a sound like something large and metallic disagreeing with itself, and then stopped working entirely at 7 in the evening when the outside temperature was 31 degrees. My mother called the furnace repair company and was told the earliest available appointment was Thursday morning. She hung up and looked at the thermostat, and then looked at me and said we were going to be fine, that she had extra blankets and the electric space heater from the basement, and that this was an adventure, which was the word she used when she wanted me to understand that a difficult thing was manageable, without making me feel the weight of how unmanageable it actually was. I got the extra blankets. She got the space heater. We sat on the couch under the blankets that Tuesday night and watched television, and the house got cold enough that I could see my breath if I turned away from the heater, and my mother made hot chocolate and called it camping. And I was 15, and I loved her, and I laughed at the camping joke, and I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that I had called my father that afternoon, before the furnace gave out, to tell him about a history project I work in, and he had mentioned during that same call that he and his girlfriend at the time had just booked a ski trip for the following February, which he was very much looking forward to because he hadn't skied in years, and she was an excellent skier, and the resort they'd chosen had gotten tremendous reviews. I thought about the ski trip and the Spacey's heater and the camping joke, and I did not say anything about any of it to my mother, because saying it would have required her to respond to it, and I did not want to put her in the position of having to defend my father or manage my feelings about my father on a Tuesday night when she was already managing a broken furnace and a 31-degree evening, and a 15-year-old wrapped in extra blankets who needed her to be okay. I filed it away. I had been filing things away for 3 years by then. I had a very large mental file by the time I was 15, and by the time I was 22, it had grown into something I could no longer pretend was not there. The furnace was the first entry. Here are some of the others. The summer I was 16, my father took me to a baseball game, one of his periodic gestures toward the scheduled quality time that had become, by then, more scheduled than time, and he paid for the tickets and the hot dogs and the overpriced sodas with the casual ease of a man for whom money is not a source of ongoing anxiety. And on the drive home he asked how things were going at the house, and I said fine, and he said good, and asked if my mother needed anything, and I said I didn't think so, and he said well she knows she can always ask, and I nodded and looked out the window and thought about the month before, when my mother had worked an extra Saturday shift at the florist shop because the car registration had come due at the same time as the rent, and the math had not quite worked out without the extra shift. She had not asked, she would not have asked, and I understood, at 16, with a clarity that was both more than I wanted and less than I could do anything with yet, that she would not ask not because she was too proud, though she was proud in the best sense of the word, but because she had understood something about my father that I was only beginning to understand, that the asking would produce a warm and genuine expression of sympathy, and a reason why right now was not the best time, and a promise about the future that would arrive like all his other promises, fully formed and completely unfounded. My father remarried when I was 19. His second wife was a woman named Brenda, pleasant and uncomplicated and entirely unaware, I believe, of the specific financial architecture of my father's first marriage and its aftermath. They bought a house together, not a rental, an actual purchase, a 4-bedroom colonial in a subdivision 20 minutes from Sycamore Lane, with a 2-car garage and a backyard that my father described to me with the particular pride of a man pointing at evidence of his own success. I visited twice. It was a nice house. It was the kind of house my mother had never been able to buy on the salary she had in the years since the divorce, while my father told people he was taking care of things. I smiled at the house and said it was lovely, and drove home to Sycamore Lane and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the yellow paint that needed touching up on the shutters and the porch my father had built 20 years ago, that was still standing because it had been built well. Whatever else was true about the man who built it, my mother never bought property, not because she couldn't have managed a mortgage on her salary, which by my late teens had grown to include a senior hygienist position at a larger practice with better pay. She couldn't buy property because the divorce settlement, managed by my father's attorney, while my mother used a legal aid service because she couldn't afford her own, had been structured in a way that left her with no equity from the marriage, and a credit history that had taken years to rebuild from the joint accounts that my father had closed strategically in the months before the divorce was finalized. By the time her credit was clean and her savings were sufficient, she had been renting Sycamore Lane for so long that leaving it felt, I think, like a kind of loss she wasn't ready for. The house was the one constant, the one place where the life she had built after everything fell apart had its address, and even though it was Gerald Fitch's house on paper, it was her house in every way that the word house actually means. Gerald Fitch died when I was 23. He was 81 years old and had owned the Sycamore Lane property since 1987 and had been, by every account I ever heard from my mother, a decent and uncomplicated landlord who fixed what needed fixing and raised the rent modestly and on a predictable schedule, and never once made my mother feel like a tenant in a way that was anything other than a simple financial arrangement between two people with straightforward mutual obligations. When he died, the property passed to his estate, and the estate, managed by his son Robert Fitch, who lived in Phoenix and had no particular attachment to a rental property in a town he hadn't lived in for 20 years, put it on the market. My mother told me on a Sunday phone call, the same Sunday calls we had maintained since I moved to Columbus for work the year after graduation. She mentioned it the way she mentioned things she had already processed, to the point of acceptance, not with distress, not dramatically, just as information. The Fitch family is selling the house, she said. Robert called to let me know. He was very decent about it, gave me 60's notice, said he'd provide a reference for a new rental. She paused. I've been looking at what's available. Prices have gone up quite a bit. I asked her how she felt about it. She said she was fine, that change was fine, that she had lived in that house for a long time, and maybe it was time for something new. She said it the way she said most difficult things, with the surface calm of a woman who had been deciding for 30 years that difficult things were manageable, underneath which, if you had been listening to her long enough and carefully enough, you could hear the thing the surface calm was covering. I had been listening to her for 23 years. I heard it. I did not say anything on the phone call about what I was already thinking, because what I was thinking was not yet a plan. It was more like the outline of a plan, the first rough shape of something that had not yet been tested against the actual numbers. I said I would help her look at rentals if she wanted a second set of eyes, and she said that would be lovely, and we talked about other things, and I hung up and opened my laptop and looked up the Sycamore Lane listing that Robert Fitch's real estate agent had posted the day before. I want to tell you what I did in the 2 weeks after that phone call, because the 2 weeks matter as much as anything else in this story, and they are the part that required the most from me. Not emotionally, though they cost me emotionally, but practically, in the specific grinding practical way of someone who has to build a financial plan under time pressure without being able to ask anyone for help because the plan has to remain invisible to work. I had been working in Columbus for 3 years by then, at a financial analysis firm where I had been hired straight out of university and where I had been promoted once already, which had come with a salary increase that had allowed me to do 2 things I had been working towards since graduation: pay down my student loans at a rate faster than the minimum, and save, quietly and consistently, into an account that I thought of the way I thought of everything I had built since I was 18, which was as mine, specifically and only mine, not a family resource, not something that would be redirected to someone else's need before it had the chance to become what I intended it to become. I had $47,000 saved. I want to tell you that number plainly, because the plainness of it matters. It was not a large amount in the context of buying a house, not comfortable, not with significant margin. It was the amount that a 23-year-old who had been paying down $41,000 in student loans while simultaneously saving for 3 years, on a financial analyst's salary, could accumulate if she spent almost nothing on anything that was not strictly necessary and treated every discretionary dollar as a decision rather than a habit. It was enough if the numbers worked. I needed the numbers to work. I called a mortgage broker named Sandra Okafor, whose name I had gotten from a colleague who had recently bought her first home, and I told Sandra I needed to understand, quickly and precisely, what I could qualify for and what the monthly payment would look like on a property in the Sycamore Lane range, and whether the timeline I was working with, 60 days, the length of my mother's notice period, was achievable. Sandra asked me 3 questions, looked at the numbers I sent her that afternoon, and called me back the next morning to tell me that yes, it was achievable, tight but achievable, and that I should be prepared for the process to move quickly if I wanted to make the timeline work. I told her to start the pre-approval process immediately. I also called that same week a real estate attorney named James Obie, who a colleague had recommended for exactly the kind of transaction I was describing: a straightforward residential purchase with some specific structuring, requirements around how the deed would be recorded and in whose name. I explained to James what I wanted to do, which was to purchase the property myself and then transfer the deed into my mother's name as a gift. James listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then asked me 2 questions: whether my mother knew about the plan and whether I had considered the gift tax implications of a property transfer of this size. She did not know, I told him, and I had considered the gift tax implications, had already looked at the annual exclusion limits and the lifetime exemption, and had determined that within the structure he would know better than I did how to execute. The transfer was manageable, without a tax event that would create a problem for either of us. James said he was impressed I had already looked at that, and I told him I worked in financial analysis, and he said that explained it, and he quoted me his fee, which was reasonable, and I told him to get started. I want to stay here for a moment, in the middle of the planning, because I think this is the part of the story where people sometimes ask the question I find most interesting to answer. They ask whether I considered, during those 2 weeks, simply telling my mother what I was doing. Whether I could have brought her in, let her know the plan, shared it with her the way you might share something this large with the person it was intended for. I considered it. I sat with it for a full evening, the pros and cons of telling her arranged on opposite sides of a mental ledger, the way I arranged everything that mattered into columns before making a decision. The pro side was obvious. She deserved to know. It was her house, her life, her security that I was building toward, and there was something that felt almost paternalistic about making a decision this significant on behalf of someone else, without their knowledge. The con side was more complicated and ultimately decisive. My mother had spent 14 years accepting the story my father told about her life, accepting that the man who said he was taking care of things was in fact taking care of things, accepting that the house she rented was a reasonable situation rather than the consequence of a divorce settlement that had been structured to leave her with nothing, accepting the surface of things the way she had always accepted the surface of things, because looking underneath required an energy she had been spending on keeping the household running and me fed and clothed and loved. I did not want to tell her I was buying her house, because telling her would require explaining why I could buy it, which would require explaining the full scope of what I now understood about the past 14 years, which would require her to look underneath the surface before she was ready to do it on her own. I wanted her to look underneath the surface at the moment of her own choosing, with the evidence already in front of her in the form of a deed with her name on it, on her birthday, in the house where she had lived for 22 years, with the whole story available to her at once, rather than in pieces she had to assemble while I watched. I wanted her to understand everything at the same moment, and I wanted my father to be there when she did. That was the part of the plan I had not told James Obie yet, because it was not a legal matter. It was a personal one, and it required a different kind of planning entirely. My mother's 48th birthday fell on a Wednesday. She had, as she did every year, organized a small dinner at the Sycamore Lane house. Nothing elaborate, never elaborate. My mother's birthday dinners were the kind she planned for other people's enjoyment rather than her own. The table set carefully. The food prepared with real attention. The people invited chosen because she loved them, rather than because they were impressive. The guest list this year was the same as most years. My Aunt Deborah, my mother's older sister, and her husband Carl, two of my mother's closest friends from the dental practice, and me. She had invited my father, as she occasionally did for my sake, and he had said he would try to make it, which in my father's language meant he intended to come but reserved the right to cancel if something more pressing arose. I called my father 2 weeks before the birthday dinner and told him I really hoped he could make it this year, that it would mean a lot to me, that I had something I wanted to share with the family, and I wanted him there for it. My father said of course, absolutely, he would be there, and I could hear in his voice the particular warm sincerity of a man who meant what he said in the moment he was saying it, which I had spent 26 years learning to receive without the weight I used to give it. I needed him there. Not to hurt him. I want to be clear about that, the same way I have been clear about it in every version of this story I have told myself over the years of planning it. I did not design this moment to wound my father. I designed it to be honest, because honesty had been missing from the story of my mother's life for 14 years. And honesty, in my experience, requires witnesses to land with its full weight. My father being in the room when my mother understood the truth was not a punishment. It was a completion. The closing of a circle that he had opened on a Sunday afternoon when I was 12 years old, and he promised, with warm certainty, that he was going to take care of things. He had not taken care of things, his daughter had, and on my mother's 48th birthday, everyone in that dining room on Sycamore Lane was going to know it at the same time. I picked up the deed from James Obie's office on the Friday before the birthday dinner. He handed it to me in a manila envelope, the recorded copy, stamped by the county, with my mother's name printed clearly in the owner of record line, and he shook my hand and said he hoped the birthday went well. I thanked him, drove to a stationery shop, bought a cream-colored envelope that felt right in my hands, and wrote my mother's name on the front in my best handwriting. I drove to Sycamore Lane that evening, not to go inside but just to park at the curb and look at it for a few minutes, the way I sometimes did when I needed to feel the reality of something I had been living inside my own head for weeks. The yellow paint on the shutters that needed touching up. The porch my father had built 20 years ago, still standing. The light in the kitchen window, that meant my mother was in there, probably making something. Probably with the radio on. Probably completely unaware that the house she was cooking in had changed ownership 11 days ago and was now, legally and permanently and irrevocably, hers. I sat at the curb for a while. Then I drove home and put the envelope on my kitchen table and made coffee that went slightly cold and waited for Wednesday. It was on the Saturday before the birthday dinner that my father called about the house. I need to back up slightly to explain why my father was trying to buy the house on Sycamore Lane, because the explanation is its own story and it tells you, more completely than anything else I could offer, everything you need to know about the specific gap between who my father believed himself to be and who he actually was. My father had, in the year since his second marriage ended, Brenda had left him after 4 years, which was a story I knew only in outline, enough to understand that the financial patterns of my father's life had not been specific to his first marriage. Developed an interest in real estate investment. He had talked about it at the Christmas gathering the year before, with the easy confidence of a man who had recently discovered a thing and already felt expert in it, telling my uncle about cap rates and cash flow, and the particular opportunity represented by long-term rental properties in stable residential neighborhoods. He had done one small deal already, a condo he had purchased and rented, and the experience had apparently confirmed for him that this was something he was good at and wanted to do more of. When the Sycamore Lane listing appeared, a small yellow house in a stable residential neighborhood with a long-term tenant who had an excellent payment history, exactly the kind of property his newly developed investment philosophy told him to look for, my father had seen it and made an offer. A fair offer, market rate, the kind of offer a motivated seller should have found straightforward to accept. Robert Fitch had declined it. Robert Fitch had declined it because I had already been in contact with Robert Fitch through James Obie, with a cash offer that closed in 3 weeks and required nothing from Robert but a signature, and Robert Fitch, who lived in Phoenix and wanted the whole thing over quickly and cleanly, had accepted it before my father's offer arrived. My father did not know this. He made a second offer, slightly above the first, because he had been told the property was under contract, but the contract had not yet closed, and he assumed, reasonably, that a better offer might change the situation. Robert Fitch, through James Obie, declined again. The contract closed, the deed recorded, my mother's name went on it. My father, unaware of any of this, had spent the following weeks genuinely puzzled about why a motivated seller had declined 2 fair offers on a small rental property without explanation, and had called me on a Sunday morning to ask if I had any idea who owned the little yellow house on Sycamore Lane. I told him I didn't know. I asked how the new baby was sleeping. I stayed on the phone for 11 more minutes, and then I hung up and put my hand on the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen table and thought, 3 more days. The thing I had not told my father, and had not told my mother, and had not told anyone except James Obie and Sandra Okafor and Keisha, my friend from university who had helped me draft the birthday dinner plan, and who had sworn on everything she held dear not to say a word, was the second piece of information that I had been carrying alongside the deed for the past 3 months. The second piece of information was about the college fund, the one that didn't exist. I had found out about it, finally and completely, not through a dramatic confrontation or an accidental discovery, but through the particular, undramatic mechanism of paying attention to a thing for long enough that eventually it told you the truth by itself. I had been watching the financial story my father told for years, the cash flow challenges, the bad timing, the it'll be sorted by spring. And I had watched it long enough and carefully enough to understand that it was not a story about temporary difficulty but about permanent fiction, the specific fiction of a man who had told a story about himself for so long that the story had become, in his own mind, a kind of truth that the facts were simply failing to catch up with. The confirmation came from an unexpected source. My father's sister, my Aunt Helen, who was visiting from out of state, and who had over one too many glasses of wine at a family gathering 18 months before the birthday dinner, said something that she clearly assumed I already knew, in the way that people say things they assume everyone already knows, and which turn out to be the one thing the person in front of them has never been told. She said, "Your father talks about you constantly, you know. He tells everyone how proud he is. He told me last Christmas he wishes he'd been able to do more for you financially, that things had been tighter than he'd planned, and the college fund never quite came together the way he'd intended." Never quite came together. I held that phrase in my mind for a moment while my aunt moved on to another subject, and I thought about the steakhouse parking lot when I was 18, and my father telling me not to worry, and the loan I had taken out that first semester, and the 4 years of additional loans that had followed, and the $41,000 I had graduated with, and the specific warm certainty with which my father had been telling anyone who asked that he was taking care of things. It had never come together, not because of cash flow challenges or bad timing or the difficulty of the divorce. Because he had never built it, there was no fund that had failed to reach its potential. There was no account that had been depleted by circumstances. There was a story, told consistently and warmly and with genuine feeling, about a thing that did not exist and had never existed, and that story had been told to his colleagues and his family and his 2 subsequent wives and very probably to himself, until the story was so much a part of how my father understood his own life, that the absence of the thing the story described had become, in some way I find both sad and clarifying, invisible to him. I sat with that for a long time after my aunt's wine-loosened confidence. I sat with it for weeks, turning it over, testing it against everything I knew, looking for the version of events that was more charitable than the one my aunt had accidentally confirmed. I found some. My father was not a calculating man, not cruel in the way that deliberate deceivers are cruel, not someone who had made a cold decision to lie to his daughter for 14 years while knowing clearly that he was lying. He was something more complicated and in some ways sadder than that. He was a man who had intended, at some point, to do what he said he was doing, and who had found it easier, as the intention faded, to maintain the story than to confront the gap between the story and the truth. I understood it. I did not forgive it yet. Forgiveness was something I would come to in my own time and in my own way, and this story is not about forgiveness, it is about truth. But I understood it, and understanding it was what allowed me to decide very clearly, and without anger, what needed to happen on my mother's 48th birthday. Not punishment, daylight. The same thing it was always about when you stripped it back to its bones. Family Revenge Co. Episode 3. My father promised he was saving for my future for 14 years. On my mother's birthday, we found out the truth. The Wednesday of my mother's 48th birthday arrived the way important. Days always arrive unremarkably, with the same gray early morning light as any other November Wednesday, the same sounds from the street outside my apartment window, the same coffee brewing in the same kitchen, where I had been sitting for 3 days, with the cream-colored envelope on the table, and my hand resting near it the way you rest your hand near something you are not quite ready to pick up and cannot quite bring yourself to put away. I had not slept particularly well the 2 nights before, not because I was afraid of what I was about to do. I had made my decision weeks earlier, and decisions made that carefully do not tend to produce the kind of fear that keeps you awake. It was something quieter than fear. Closer to the feeling you have the night before something you have been working toward for a very long time, when the working toward is almost over and what comes next is simply the arrival of the thing itself, and you understand that arrival and preparation are 2 completely different experiences, and that all your preparation has not fully equipped you for the specific weight of the moment when it actually comes. I got up at 6. I showered and dressed in the particular deliberate way I dressed on days that mattered. Not formally, not as though I was trying to signal anything to anyone, but with attention, the way you pay attention to things when you understand that the details of a day are going to stay with you. I had eggs and coffee and read nothing, which was unusual for me because I found I did not want my mind on anything else that morning. I wanted it on this, on what was coming, on the yellow house on Sycamore Lane, and the porch my father had built, and the 14 years my mother had paid rent on a home that was now, as of 11 days ago, hers. I picked up the envelope at 8:30 and put it in my bag and drove to Sycamore Lane. My mother did not know I was coming early. She expected me at 5, the same time as the other guests, which was what I had told her when she called on Sunday, to go over the dinner arrangements with the organizational thoroughness she brought to everything she planned, however small. I had not told her I was coming at 9 in the morning, and when she opened the front door in her housecoat with her reading glasses on and a dish towel over her shoulder, her face did the thing it did when something pleasant happened unexpectedly. A quick open surprise, and then warmth, the specific warmth of a woman who had spent most of her life being pleasantly surprised by small things because she had learned not to expect large ones. "Nora, you're here early." "I wanted to help," I said, which was true in the way that partial truths are true, and she stepped back and let me in, and the house folded around me the way it always did. The particular smell of it that I had been trying to name my entire life and never quite managed. Wood and something floral and something warm from the kitchen, and underneath all of it, something that was simply the accumulated presence of years of living carefully inside 4 walls you loved. I did not give her the envelope that morning. I had decided, in the nights of not quite sleeping, that the morning was not the right time. The morning was for helping, for being in the kitchen beside her the way I had been in the kitchen beside her my whole life, her at the counter and me at the table, or vice versa. The particular rhythm of 2 people who know how to share a kitchen because they have been sharing it since one of them was old enough to stand at the counter and reach the mixing bowl. I put my bag down by the door and took off my coat and asked what needed doing. What needed doing was the kind of quiet, patient kitchen work that my mother had always been better at than anyone I knew. The pie crust that needed resting in the refrigerator before it was rolled, the potatoes that needed peeling, the green beans that needed trimming, the birthday cake that my mother made herself every year from the recipe her own mother had given her, the kind of chocolate cake that required real attention and could not be rushed and produced every time, something so precisely right that I had never once in my 26 years wanted any other kind of birthday cake on any birthday. We worked in the kitchen for 2 hours, and we talked the way we always talked when we were in the kitchen together. Not about large things, not at first, but about the small, specific things that fill a life and that most people never bother to describe to each other because they assume they are too small to be worth describing. She told me about a patient at the practice who had, after 7 years of coming in every 6 months, finally followed through on getting the crown he'd been putting off, and the look on his face when she told him how much better it was going to be, and how that was the part of the job that had never gotten old. I told her about a colleague at the firm who had started leaving extremely passive-aggressive notes in the kitchen about the correct way to load the dishwasher, and which had become, over the preceding month, something of an office cultural event. She laughed. The real kind, the kind that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth, which was the kind I had been storing up since I was small as the specific proof that I was doing something right. Around 11, when the cake was in the oven and the kitchen had the warm particular smell of chocolate baking, and the potatoes were done, and we were sitting at the kitchen table with tea, my mother looked at me with the look she used when she was about to say something she had been holding for a while. "Are you all right?" she said. "You seem, I don't know, present, like you're paying a lot of attention to everything." I almost told her then. The look on her face, the directness of it, the way she could still, after 26 years, catch me in the middle of something I thought I was hiding, it almost undid the whole careful architecture of the plan I had spent weeks building. I wanted very badly, in that moment, to put the bag on the table and take out the envelope and say, "Here, Mom, read this, it's yours. It's been yours since 11 days ago, and you don't have to worry about where you're going to live or what it costs or whether Gerald Fitch's son is going to sell the house out from under you ever again. Because your name is on the deed and the deed is recorded at the county and nobody can move you." I did not. I held the moment and breezed through it and said, "I'm fine. I'm just glad to be here." She looked at me for one more second, the particular measuring look of a woman who has been reading her daughter since her daughter was an infant and has gotten very good at it. And then she nodded and looked back at her tea, and I understood that she had decided to let me have my privacy for now, which was one of the most specific kindnesses my mother had always offered me. the space to arrive at a thing on my own time, in my own way, without being pushed. I loved her, sitting at that kitchen table in a way that did not need language and would not have been made larger by it. My Aunt Deborah and her husband Carl arrived at 4:30, 30 minutes before the official start. Because Deborah had always operated on the principle that being early was a form of love, and being late was a form of selfishness, a view she had held without modification since approximately 1987. Deborah was my mother's older sister by 5 years, broader and louder and more immediately present than my mother in every social situation, the kind of woman who walked into a room and began immediately improving it, rearranging things and complimenting things and asking questions, and producing the specific productive chaos of someone who cared deeply about the quality of other people's experiences and was not going to wait to be invited to contribute to it. She hugged my mother for a long time at the door and said happy birthday to my favorite person and handed over a bottle of wine and a small wrapped box. And then she turned to me and hugged me almost as long and said, "You look wonderful, and what are you not telling me?" Which was the kind of thing Deborah said because she paid attention the same way my mother paid attention, and she had been looking at me since I arrived and had noticed the same quality my mother had noticed at the kitchen table. "Nothing," I said, the same way I had said it to my mother. Deborah looked at me for a moment with the look of a woman who did not entirely believe me and had decided to proceed anyway, which was a look I recognized because it was exactly the look my mother used in the same circumstances. Then Carl handed me a grocery bag of things he'd been asked to bring, and I took it to the kitchen, and the moment passed. My mother's friends from the dental practice arrived at 5, 2 women named Rosemary and June who had worked alongside her for 11 and 8 years respectively, and who were the kind of friends that adult working life produces when you're lucky, the kind built from years of coffee in the break room and covering each other's patience and knowing without asking when the other person is having a day that requires chocolate rather than conversation. They brought flowers and wine and the easy, affectionate noise of people who were genuinely glad to be there, and the house filled with the warm, specific sound of a birthday dinner actually becoming itself. My father arrived at 5:15, which was earlier than I had expected given his history with arrival times and which told me something about how seriously he had taken my request that he be there. He came in through the front door with a bottle of wine and a small gift wrapped in silver paper, and the particular social ease of a man who was comfortable in almost any room, including, apparently, the kitchen of his ex-wife's birthday dinner where his daughter was standing with a cream-colored envelope in her bag, and 14 years of carefully observed evidence in her memory. He hugged my mother first, the brief warm hug of two people who have traveled far enough from their shared history to be comfortable with each other's presence, without being comfortable enough to linger in it. My mother received it with the gracious composure she brought to everything involving my father, which I had watched my entire life and which still impressed me, the specific achievement of a woman who had decided that her own dignity was more important than whatever feelings the situation might otherwise produce. He hugged me second, longer, and said, "You look wonderful," which was the same thing Deborah had said and which produced in me, from these two different people, two completely different responses. From Deborah, warmth, because Deborah's observation came from the specific love of someone who had been watching me grow up with full attention. From my father, something more complicated, because his came from someone who had been telling himself a story about how I was doing for 26 years without looking closely enough to know whether the story was true. "Glad you made it, Dad," I said. "Of course," he said, "I wouldn't have missed it." He mixed easily into the gathering, the way he always mixed into gatherings, moving from Deborah and Carl to Rosemary and June with the comfortable fluency of a man for whom social situations were not a challenge to be navigated but a pleasure to be inhabited. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, where I was refilling the water pitcher, and I thought about the Sunday call from 3 days ago, how he had asked me about the yellow house on Sycamore Lane with genuine puzzlement, how he had no idea that the house he was standing in, the house where his daughter and his ex-wife had lived for 14 years while he was taking care of things, now had a different name on the deed than it had ever had before. 3 days ago, I had told him I didn't know. Tonight, he was going to find out. Dinner was the kind my mother made when she wanted people to feel at home in the most fundamental sense of the word. Not impressive in the restaurant way. Not the kind of food that produces admiring comments about technique or presentation, but the kind that produces something quieter and more durable, The feeling of being fed by someone who understood that feeding people was an act of love and not a performance. Roast chicken and roasted potatoes and the green beans we had trimmed together that morning, and a salad that Deborah had contributed, and fresh bread from the bakery 2 streets over that Carl had been sent to collect on the way, and the chocolate cake waiting on the counter, still in its pan, the frosting set, the candles not yet placed. We ate, and we talked. And the table had the sound of a dinner that was going well in the specific way of gatherings where everyone present actually likes each other and has real things to say. And I sat at my usual place, the chair I had sat in since I was old enough to sit at the table, and I ate, and I participated, and I watched the room with the particular attention I had been bringing to rooms since I was 9 years old, and first understood that watching carefully was the thing I was best at. My father was at the opposite end of the table from me, between Rosemary and Carl, and he was in good form, funny, engaged, the version of himself that was easiest to be around and that made it simplest to understand why people who didn't know the full picture of his life found him so genuinely likable. He told a story about something that had happened at his office that made Carl laugh with the involuntary helplessness of a man caught off guard by something genuinely funny. He asked Rosemary about her work with the interest of someone who actually intended to listen to the answer, which he did. He was, in the most visible and social sense, a good person to have at a dinner table, and I noted this without bitterness and without the kind of resentment that would have made what I was about to do feel like something other than what it was. My mother, at the head of the table, was the version of herself that she was only at home, in her own dining room with people she had chosen, relaxed in the specific way of someone who has, for one evening, set down the weight they carry the rest of the time. She laughed more easily than usual. She let Deborah refill her wine without her customary "the one glass is plenty." She looked for the duration of that dinner like the woman she might have been more consistently if the preceding 14 years had gone differently, and that thought sat in my chest with a particular weight that I did not try to move because it was the right weight to be carrying into what came next. After the main course, while June and Carl were clearing plates and my father was in the middle of a conversation with Deborah about something I was not tracking closely, I got up from the table quietly and went to the front hallway where I had put my bag when I arrived that morning. I took out the cream-colored envelope with my mother's name on the front in my best handwriting. I held it for a moment in the hallway, in the quiet that was just a few feet from the dinner table noise, and I thought about Ruth. Not my grandmother, but the version of my mother I had seen at that dinner table tonight, the woman who looked like she had set something down for a few hours, and I thought about what it was going to mean for her to pick up something different. Something permanent, something with her name on it in a county record office that nobody could change without her signature. I walked back to the table. Nobody noticed me come back, which was appropriate. I had been not being noticed for a long time and I was comfortable with it, and this was the last moment of the not being noticed, which I understood as I crossed the dining room floor and took my seat. I waited until the cake. I had decided weeks ago that the cake was the right moment, after the dinner, after the ease of the evening had fully settled into the room, after my mother had had time to simply be at her own birthday table and feel what it felt like to be celebrated by the people who actually showed up for her. I did not want to do it before all of that. I wanted all of that to have happened first, so that what came after could land in a room that was already full of love rather than a room that was still finding its temperature. Deborah brought the cake from the kitchen with the candles lit, the small procession of it, and we sang, and my mother made the face she made every year at the singing. The particular combination of genuine pleasure and slight embarrassment that people make when they are being sung to in their own dining room by people who love them. And she blew out the candles, and Deborah said, "What did you wish for?" And my mother said, "If I tell you, it won't come true," which was what she said every year. The cake was cut and passed and eaten and complimented, and Deborah topped up the wine, and Carl said something that made the table laugh. And it was in the warmth of that moment, the room at its most itself, the candles on the table, the chocolate cake half eaten, the people who had actually shown up arranged around the woman who had always shown up for everyone else, that I reached into my lap where the cream-colored envelope had been sitting since I came back from the hallway, and I set it on the table in front of my mother. The room did not go quiet immediately. It went quiet the way rooms go quiet when someone does something unexpected, a beat behind the action, the conversation finishing its current sentence before the attention shifts, and then the shift, all eyes moving to the cream-colored envelope on the table with my mother's name and my handwriting on the front. "What's this?" my mother said, looking at the envelope and then at me. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said. "Open it when you're ready." She looked at me for a moment with the measuring look, the one she had been giving me all day, the one that told me she had known since 9 o'clock this morning that something was coming and had been patient enough to wait for it to arrive on its own. Then she picked up the envelope with the careful hands of someone who understood that the care she brought to it was appropriate, that whatever was inside deserved to be opened deliberately rather than torn into. She slid her finger under the flap, she unfolded the document inside, she began to read. I watched her face the way I had watched rooms my entire life, with the specific, patient attention of someone who understood that the most important information was not in the words but in what the face did when it encountered them. For the first moment, she was simply reading, the focused, neutral expression of comprehension, and then something shifted. Some word on the page landed differently than the ones before it, and her eyes stopped moving and she was very still. She looked up at me. "Nora, keep reading," I said. She looked back down. She read the rest of it, and I watched the stillness in her face become something else. Not the surface calm she applied to difficult things. Not the composure she had worn for 14 years over everything that had cost her more than she showed. Something underneath the surface, rising slowly the way something rises when the surface finally stops being held down by the effort of holding it. She set the document on the table. She put both hands flat beside it, the way I put my hands flat on surfaces when I needed to feel something solid. She looked at the document, and then she looked at me, and her eyes were bright in a way I had not seen from her in a very long time, maybe ever. "This is the deed to this house," she said. "Yes," I said. "My name is on it. Yes, Nora." Her voice was doing something it almost never did, something I had heard perhaps twice in my life. It was losing its steadiness, not collapsing, not breaking, but the steadiness was no longer being applied, the way you stop holding something when you no longer need to hold it. "You bought this house." "I bought it 3 weeks ago," I said. "It's been yours for 11 days. The table was entirely silent now. Deborah had her hand over her mouth. June was looking between my mother and me with an expression I would have found funny in any other moment, the complete, unguarded surprise of someone watching something unfold that they had not been prepared for and could not quite keep up with. Carl was very still in the way of a man who understands he is witnessing something significant and has the wisdom to simply witness it. Rosemary was crying quietly, which she would probably have been embarrassed about later and which I found, in the moment, the most honest response in the room. My father, at the end of the table, had gone very still in a way that was different from Carl's stillness. His was the stillness of someone who had just heard something that had changed the shape of a room he thought he understood, and who was now, rapidly and without adequate preparation, reconfiguring. He was looking at the document on the table in front of my mother. He was looking at the address printed at the top. My mother looked up from the deed and across the table at my father. And I watched something happen between them that I had not watched happen in 14 years. Which was my mother looking at my father with the full, unfiltered honesty of a woman who had decided, in this specific moment, to stop applying the surface calm and simply look. "Dennis," she said, quietly, just his name. My father looked at her. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at the document. He looked at me. He looked at me. He looked back at the document. "That's Sycamore Lane," he said, not a question. He already knew it was Sycamore Lane. He had been trying to buy Sycamore Lane for 6 months. "Yes," I said. The silence that followed was the kind that a room produces when everyone in it is doing the same calculation at the same time, and arriving at the same answer, the kind of silence that has a weight to it that you can actually feel pressing on the surface of things. I watched my father arrive at the answer, watched the specific moment it fully assembled itself in his understanding. The deal he had been pursuing for 6 months, the owner who had declined his offers without explanation, his daughter sitting across the table from him with her hands in her lap and the cream-colored envelope open beside her mother's plate. And I watched his face do something I had never seen it do before, which was to lose, completely and without recovery, the warm, easy confidence that had been its expression for as long as I had been at it had it. "Nora," he said. "Did you—" "I bought it," I said, "and I put it in Mom's name. It's been hers for 11 days. Deborah made a sound beside me that was not quite a word, but contained in its 2 syllables everything that the room was feeling, which was the particular combination of shock and recognition and something close to awe that arrives when you watch someone do something you did not know was possible until the moment you saw it done. My father looked at my mother. My mother was still looking at the deed, her hands still flat on the table beside it, the expression on her face still doing the thing it had been doing since she finished reading, the surface calm completely absent, something true and long-held rising in its place. "Patricia," my father said, and there was something in his voice that I had not heard there before, something that sounded like a man beginning to understand the distance between the story he had been telling and the place everyone else had actually been living. My mother looked up at him. She said his name the same way she had said it a moment ago, just the name, just Dennis, quietly with the full and honest weight of 14 years behind it. And then she said the thing that I think she had been holding for a very long time without knowing she was holding it. The thing that came up not in anger, not with the heat of someone who had been wronged and finally had permission to say so, but with the quiet, clear, irrefutable tone of a woman stating a fact that she had known for years and was only now in this room on her birthday, with her name on the deed of the house she had paid rent on for 22 years, allowing herself to say out loud, "You told everyone you were taking care of us," she said. "For 14 years you told everyone that, your family, your colleagues, your wives." She paused, one breath steady. "Our daughter paid for her own education. I paid my own rent. We took care of ourselves, Dennis. We always did. I just never said it out loud before because I didn't want Nora to carry the weight of knowing it." The room was so quiet I could hear the candle on the table. My father looked at my mother and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would add to or subtract from the truth of what she had just stated, and my father, whatever else was true about him, was not a stupid man, and he understood in that moment that the distance between the story and the truth had just been made visible to every person at that table, and that no amount of warmth or charm or genuine good intention could close it. He looked at me, I looked at him, and I said the thing I had been holding, not angrily, not as a wound delivered, but as a fact stated, the way I had always preferred to deal with facts. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Dad," I said. "I need you to know that. I'm telling you because Mom has been living in this house for 22 years and paying for it every month on her own, and the story you told meant she did it without anyone knowing that's what was happening. She deserved to have this house. She earned it. I just made it official." My father looked at the table. For a long moment he said nothing, and then he said something I had not expected him to say, which told me that the man sitting at the end of the table right now was not entirely the same man who had been sitting there an hour ago. He said, "You're right," 2 words, quietly, without qualification, without the follow-up sentence that would have softened them or redirected them or placed them in a context that made them easier to say. Just, "You're right," said to the table, and then looked up and said again to my mother, "You're right, Nora, and Patricia, I'm sorry. I have been sorry for a long time about things I should have done differently, and I let the being sorry get confused with having actually done something about it, and that's," he stopped. "That's not the same thing. I know that now. I think I've known it for a while." The dinner ended the way important evenings end when something large and true has happened inside them, not dramatically, not with anyone storming out or voices raised or the kind of scene that makes a good story at someone else's expense. It ended quietly, the way a storm ends, the air different afterward than it was before. Cleaner somehow, the particular clarity that comes when something that has been held under pressure for a long time is finally allowed to simply be what it is. Deborah was the one who broke the silence first, because Deborah had never in her life allowed a silence to go on longer than it needed to, and she had the particular gift of knowing, instinctively, what a silence needed to become next. She reached across the table and covered my mother's hand with hers and said, "Patricia, your daughter bought you a house." And she said it not as a restatement of information everyone already had, but as a thing that needed to be said out loud, slowly, so that the full weight of it could be felt properly, rather than processed at the speed of shock. My mother looked at Deborah, and then she looked at me. And she cried, finally, the real kind, the kind she had been holding back since she read the deed. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep and so long stored that when it finally arrives it is not sadness and not happiness, but something that contains both and is larger than either. She put her hands over her face and she cried, and Deborah held her and June past the tissue box that had materialized from somewhere, and Carl looked at the ceiling in the specific way of a decent man who does not know what to do with a room full of emotion, and has decided that the ceiling is the most respectful place to look. I did not go to her immediately. I let Deborah hold her because Deborah was what she needed in that first minute. The sister. The oldest love, the person who had known her since before any of this, since before my father and the house and the divorce and the 14 years. I sat at my own place at the table and watched my mother cry and felt the particular sensation of something I had been carrying for a long time setting itself down. My father left shortly after. He said goodnight to my mother with the careful, subdued consideration of a man who understood that his presence was something the room needed less of right now. Not out of cruelty but out of the simple reality that some conversations need to happen without the person they are partly about in the room. He squeezed my shoulder on his way past my chair and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that he needed to think and that he would call me. I nodded and let him go and heard the front door close behind him and felt the room exhale slightly, the way rooms exhale when a complicated presence leaves them. Rosemary and June helped clean up, the efficient, loving cleanup of people who understood that the best thing they could do right now was make the kitchen tidy and then go home, which they did, with hugs from my mother that lasted longer than usual, and the look from Rosemary directed at me over my mother's shoulder that I will not try to describe because it was the kind of look that does not translate into language but that I understood completely and that I have thought about several times since. Deborah and Carl stayed longer, because Deborah was not going anywhere until she was certain her sister was all right, which was not Deborah imposing herself but Deborah being exactly who she was, which was the kind of sister who showed up and stayed. Carl made tea, quietly and without being asked, because Carl had been married to Deborah for 23 years and understood that making tea was sometimes the most important contribution a person could make to a situation. The four of us sat in the living room with our tea and the birthday candles burned down on the table in the next room, and the deed still on the table where my mother had set it, and we talked. Not about my father, not immediately, not the full reckoning that would come later in other conversations. We talked about the house. My mother asked me, her voice still slightly unsteady at the edges but growing steadier as she talked, how I had done it. The mechanics of it, the timeline, how I had known about Gerald Fitch's son selling, how I had managed the financing. I told her everything, in order, the same way I had always preferred to tell things. Clearly, without performance, with the relevant facts presented so that the picture was complete rather than impressionistic. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she listened when something mattered to her most. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she asked the question I had been expecting and had been thinking about how to answer honestly. She asked why I hadn't told her. I told her the truth. I told her that I had wanted her to understand everything at once rather than in pieces because I knew that pieces would have required her to manage my feelings about her situation while she was still in the middle of processing her feelings about her situation, and I had decided, selfishly or not, that she deserved to have the full picture arrive in one moment rather than be assembled over weeks of difficult conversations. I told her that I had also, if I was being completely honest, needed to do it this way for myself. Needed it to be complete before it was shared. The way I had always needed things to be finished before I could let anyone see them, because unfinished things in my family had a way of being absorbed before they became what they were supposed to become. She looked at me for a long moment and then she said something that was so precisely her that I have stored it in the specific place where I keep the things I never want to forget. She said, "You have been taking care of things your whole life without letting anyone know you were doing it. I thought I taught you that. I'm not sure anymore whether that was the right thing to teach you." I said, "You taught me to be strong. I figured out the quiet part on my own." She smiled then, the real one, the one that started in her eyes. And Deborah laughed and Carl said, "Well, I think that's the most anyone said in this living room in 20 years, and the room shifted into something warmer and lighter, the afterweather of a storm that has fully passed and left everything it touched slightly cleaner than it was before." Deborah and Carl left around 11. My mother and I did the last of the tidying together, the final dishes, the candles cleared from the table, the deed folded carefully and placed by my mother on the kitchen counter where she could see it, not in a drawer, not put away, just placed where she could look at it whenever she wanted to, which I noticed she did, twice, while we were finishing the kitchen, the way you look at something you are still learning the reality of. When the kitchen was done, we sat at the table with the last of the tea, and my mother put her hand over mine on the table and did not say anything for a while, and I did not say anything either because nothing needed to be said and we both knew it, and that particular silence was the most different kind from all the other silences in the story I have been telling you, because it was not the silence of something being held or managed or covered over. It was the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were now simply sitting inside the truth of it together, which is its own thing entirely, and which I had not known I was missing until I felt what it was like to have it. I stayed the night, which I had not planned to do but which felt, by 11 o'clock, like the only right thing. I slept in my childhood bedroom, the same room I had grown up in, and I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me and thought about the deed on the kitchen counter with my mother's name on it and felt, for the first time in the months since I had started planning this, the specific sensation of something finished. Not resolved in the sense of everything being repaired. There was no version of this story in which 14 years of a particular kind of absence became something else overnight. No version in which $41,000 of student loans vanished. No version in which my father became a different man than the one he had been. But finished in the sense that the truth was now in the room. All of it, at once, in front of everyone. And truth, once it is in the room, cannot be put back. It simply becomes part of the room from that point forward, and everything that happens in the room happens in its presence whether or not anyone is talking about it. That is, I have found, enough. Not everything, but enough. My father called 4 days later. I had expected him to take longer, to sit with it for weeks the way some people sit with difficult things, but he called on Sunday and I answered, and he was different on the phone from the man I had spoken to every Sunday for 26 years. Different in the specific way of someone who has had 4 days alone with the truth about themselves and has not been able to find a comfortable way to arrange it. He did not begin with the warm, easy competence. He began with my name and then with silence, the kind of silence that costs something to maintain. And then he said, "I need to ask you something, Nora, and I need you to tell me honestly." I said I would. "Did you know," he said, "when you were in school, did you know the fund wasn't there?" "I suspected by the second year," I said. "I knew for certain by the third." He was quiet for a long time. "And you didn't say anything?" "Neither did you," I said, not unkindly, "just the fact of it." Another silence. Then, "No, I didn't." He paused. I kept thinking I was going to fix it, that something was going to change and I was going to be able to make it right before anyone had to know it had gone wrong. And the longer it went on, the harder it got to say anything, because saying anything meant admitting how long it had been wrong. He stopped. "That's not an excuse. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you that as an excuse." "I know," I said. "I've been telling myself a story about who I am as a father," he said, "and I think I've known for a while that the story and the facts weren't quite matching up. I kept choosing the story." He paused again. "I'm done choosing the story. I don't know exactly what that looks like going forward, but I'm done with it." I believed him. Not completely, not yet. Belief in a changed person is a sequence of observations over time, not a single decision, and I had one data point, which was this phone call. But I believed him enough to stay in the conversation, which is where I needed to start. I told him I was not interested in relitigating everything, that the past was documented and real and did not need to be argued about anymore. What I wanted from him going forward was simpler and more specific than anything that required relitigating. I wanted him to be honest. Not about everything all at once, not with some grand gesture of transparency, just honest in the ordinary daily sense, about what he could do and what he couldn't, about what was true and what was a story, about the difference between intending to do something and actually doing it. I told him that honesty practiced consistently in small things was the only way I knew of to make the larger things eventually trustworthy. He said he understood. He said he was going to try. I told him trying was where everything started and that I was willing to see what trying looked like. We have spoken every Sunday since. The calls are different from the ones before the birthday dinner, shorter in some ways, more substantial in others. The particular substance of conversations between two people who have agreed to stop performing for each other and are still learning what they actually have to say. He asks about my work now, real questions, the follow-up kind. He told me recently that he had been thinking about the ski trip from the year I was 15, the year the furnace broke, and that he was sorry, not for the ski trip specifically, but for the pattern it represented, for the years of choosing his comfort over my reality while telling himself the story that I was fine. I did not tell him it was okay because it was not fully okay yet. I told him I appreciated him saying it, which was true and was, I thought, the honest thing rather than the easy thing. My mother called me the morning after the birthday dinner early before I had fully processed the night before, and she said she had been lying awake thinking about the deed on the kitchen counter and that she needed to ask me something. She asked whether I needed the money back, not as an offer, as a genuine question, the kind that came from the specific concern of a mother who has spent a lifetime making sure her daughter had enough, and who had just been handed something large and was wondering whether it had cost her daughter more than it should have. I told her no. I told her the finances were structured in a way that worked for me and that the house was hers without qualification or condition, and that the only thing I wanted from her in return was exactly what she had always given me, which was the particular steady presence of a woman who showed up and kept showing up regardless of what the showing up cost her. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I am so proud of you, Nora. I have always been proud of you. But I want you to know that what you did, not just the house, but the way you did it, the patience of it, the care, that is the finest thing I have ever watched anyone do. And I watched you do it at my own birthday table without knowing it was coming, which is exactly the kind of thing you have always done and which I have not always said out loud the way I should have." I told her that meant more than the house, and I meant it completely. My mother has lived in the Sycamore Lane house as its owner for 7 months now. The practical reality of ownership has not changed her daily life in any dramatic visible way. She still drinks her coffee at the same kitchen table, still goes to work at the dental practice, still has Deborah over for dinner on the second Sunday of every month. But there is something different in how she moves through the house, something I noticed the first time I visited after the deed was recorded, and have noticed every time since. A particular ease, a groundedness, the specific quality of a person who is standing on something they know will not be moved from underneath them while they are standing on it. She repainted the shutters last month. The yellow she chose is almost identical to the original but slightly warmer, which she told me she had spent 3 weeks deciding on, which made me laugh because that was so precisely her that I could not have invented it. She sent me a photo of the finished shutters on a Saturday morning with a text that said simply, "Mine." I looked at that text for a long time before I replied because it was the most complete sentence I had ever received from her. The porch my father built is still standing. I think about that sometimes, how the most enduring thing he contributed to that house was the one he built with his hands, before he understood that building things with your hands was not the same as taking care of the people who lived inside them, and how it is still there, still holding, still doing what it was built to do regardless of what happened to the man who built it. There is probably something instructive in that. I have not yet decided exactly what. I have $42,000 in student loans remaining, which is $1,000 less than when I graduated because I made my first extra payment the month after the birthday dinner with the specific satisfaction of a person who is clearing a debt that should never have existed and is doing it anyway, one payment at a time, because that is how everything real gets done. I do not resent the loans the way I might have. They are part of the story of how I learned to build things on foundations I made myself, rather than on promises other people made for me. And that knowledge is worth something, even if the tuition for it was higher than it should have been. If you have ever been the child who paid for themselves while the parent who promised to take care of it told everyone at dinner that things were handled. If you have ever been the one who figured it out quietly while someone else got the credit for a floor you built yourself, tell me about it in the comments, because I read every single one and I want you to know something that took me 26 years and a county deed to understand fully. The people who made you figure it out on your own did not make you strong. You were already strong. They just made you prove it sooner than you should have had to, which is not the same thing as a gift, no matter how it gets dressed up in retrospect. What you built in the figuring out is yours. Every dollar of it, every decision of it, every quiet night of it when nobody was watching and you kept going anyway. That belongs to you. It always did. Subscribe to Family Revenge Comb, where the quiet ones always get the last word. I'll see you at the next table.